All right, I want to make sure everybody can hear me. Okay, so raise your hand if you're currently a data scientist. And if you're looking to hire a data scientist. And if you want a job as a data scientist. Okay, good. So this is mostly for people who are thinking about hiring data scientists, but it's going to be very relevant to those of us who are also looking for a job. And if you are currently a data scientist, it might help you think about how to define your role and sorts of, what else you might want to learn how to do. I'm coming from a research background, and when I went to look for my first data scientist position, I talked to a hiring manager who was very nice about saying, well, you don't need to know that much Python because we pair our scientists with engineers. So I went in to do the interview, and my strengths were, at that time, really an ad hoc analysis. And they said, you need to learn more Python. So I went home and I learned more Python. And I went to another interview. And they said, can you do a coding exercise in Excel? And I said, I don't want a job writing Excel. So I went to another interview, and they said, can you do this really complex SQL query? No, I didn't know how to do that. So I went home and learned more SQL. I went to another interview. They asked me about multi-threading and really high-level Python things like decorators. I went and learned more Python. Came back, did another interview, and they quizzed me on statistics. I wasn't very good at doing pop quizzes. I never have been, I'm still not. I went to another interview, and they started quizzing me on machine learning. So I was finding overall, here are my observations. First of all, I can't iterate on this process. There was almost nothing in common from one interview to the next. Even the questions that you might think would be typical, what's a normal distribution? Very rarely got asked that question. The sorts of things they tell you to prepare, almost never got asked those. If there was a pattern, I was having a hard time figuring out what it was, and I felt like a lot of these companies were using the interview process to try to decide what they wanted, because they really hadn't thought about it ahead of time. Right, so as much as I was trying to sample companies, they were trying to sample candidates, and they didn't seem to know where to begin. So when I went back and did a sort of a pseudo-analysis, looking at my notes and thinking about what questions were in common, there were only two types of roles where it really seemed like there was any consistency. One was an analyst position where they really always asked you about SQL, and the other was at the other extreme where it was a software engineering position, and they pretty much always asked you to do whiteboarding. Everything else was a mix, and fairly frequently I was asked, are you sure you want to be a data scientist? Or are you sure you wouldn't consider this other role? So I really want to talk today about how data science spans this whole spectrum. Everything from an analyst who maybe doesn't know how to code at all, but is perfectly fine working with a bunch of data that's already clean, to someone who's maybe a software engineer who's very comfortable writing algorithms, and everything in between. Where a lot of us are really somewhere in between, and what you actually want if you're trying to hire a data scientist is someone who can generate insights. Someone who understands the scientific process, they're comfortable asking questions, and trying to figure out how do we address a problem that's never been solved before. So I volunteered to give this talk partly because I'm coming from a research background where we regularly interviewed people. And I was kind of shocked at how the software industry does this, because it's so different from what I was coming from. So from my perspective, if you have to interview someone and you can't give them a test, there's three things you can do that are very easy. One is that you look at their work product, right? You ask them to show you a portfolio of the work they've done in the past. The second is they might ask you questions, and that's maybe even more important than the questions you're asking them. Have they really thought about this role? Are they capable of narrowing down what makes this role different from some other role? And can they tell you a story? Can they define a problem, explain how they addressed it, and talk about the possible pitfalls and how they address them? So I'm going to talk about the pitfalls that I've seen in the software industry interview process for data science. It basically spans, again, a spectrum from under-specifying the role to over-specifying the role. So if you underspecify the role, I think what typically happens is somebody says, we need to hire a data scientist, and they don't know what that means, right? And they probably hand off that job to someone who's maybe an engineer, maybe someone who doesn't even know statistics, and now they're tasked with interviewing someone, and they don't really know where to begin. So in those cases, you might end up with a very open-ended problem. They might give you a dump of data and say, tell us what our data means, right? Which is great, except it's not clear what they're looking for. And frequently, they don't know. And that means they don't know how to evaluate what you've given them. And they're going to be comparing apples and oranges when people submit wildly different kinds of solutions to, here's what I found in your data. So I would argue that if you're going to do that kind of thing, it makes you look like, as a company, you haven't really prioritized the types of questions you want answered. And you didn't really put the time into planning, what are we trying to interview for? And the other end is the stats pop quiz, where they might say, here's an extremely vague scenario. What would you do if we gave you 2 data sets and you had to tell them apart or something? And I've actually had interviews like this where I said, can you give me more information? Can you tell me the distribution of the data? Can you tell me how many times the data was sampled, how frequently? And they're like, no, just tell us what you would do. And I'm going, that's not how you would actually do this, right? So they want me to read their mind about some other piece of information or their business context that I can't possibly know. So again, I would say this is the inability to think as a hiring manager from the perspective of the candidate. They don't have access to all of the things that you know. So if you're going to give them these kinds of questions, you need to give them enough context to understand why you're asking. And then the other end of the spectrum is overspecifying the role. These are the people who think they want only someone who's done exactly a certain thing. And Peter Wang talked about this briefly in his talk yesterday. I want someone who's done Spark, right? Scala. We want Scala. Scala's hot. The problem is next year, Scala's going to be out of date. So, the question is, why are you asking me this? Did you not read my CV? Did you not believe my CV? Or are you hoping that even though this thing wasn't on my CV, that maybe I have actually done it? So like, for example, if you've worked in a proprietary setting, you may have all kinds of interesting projects that you're not really allowed to discuss. So they're not on your GitHub. And in that case, asking this kind of question can be useful because you can have an opportunity to maybe talk vaguely about a story or a type of technique you've used that was relevant. But this kind of question, again, it tends to narrow the field so much that you might be weeding people out who could learn X thing very quickly. But just because they haven't done it before doesn't mean that you shouldn't continue talking to them. And then are you sure you're not willing to do some other role? And often with the bait of, but you'd be around other people who are doing data science, or we might have a need for a data scientist in 6 months. And this kind of thing may be, we think you're not really qualified, but we like you. We want to offer you some entry-level position that we think you might be comfortable doing. Or we have a lot of data, but we know it's not useful to be analyzed yet because we really need someone to clean it up. Are you sure you're not willing to do the data engineering? Or we're really just looking for smart people. We'd be happy to slot you into a software engineer position. You seem like you're smart, as long as you're willing to work hard. And again, this can kind of overspecify the role. This can mean that you're taking someone who's expressed a certain interest in a certain type of role, and you're trying to shoehorn them into something else. So those kinds of interviews often include many levels of jump through flaming hoops, answer a trick coding question, how much SQL do you know, can you do live coding with no syntax highlighting or any kind of reference material, and my personal favorite, the language agnostic pair programming exercise. Bottom line, it's not language agnostic if it's not in Python. If you've told them Python is your main language and they want you to interview in Java, there's some trick that you need to know that's Java specific that Python takes care of for you, right? And they're going to judge you that you didn't know that trick, even though they told you the interview was language agnostic. And they'll say that it's pair programming, but it's not. The person that you're working with is evaluating you, and they're not going to give you any help with the question. So again, I feel like a lot of times these interviews come from a place of totally unrealistic expectations because they're not really thinking about what does a data scientist do. They're coming from a history of we've analyzed how to interview an analyst and how to interview a software engineer, and we still don't really know how to interview a data scientist. So I have some suggestions. First of all, don't use the interview to randomly sample candidate space. And I think this often, the telltale sign is when the job description is not clear, or if it's really overambitious and it's a giant list of skills. That's a sign that the company either isn't sure what they want, or there's multiple people who want different things. And I wrote a blog post a while back about when the recruiter and the hiring manager and the team all have different ideas about what sort of candidate they should be interviewing. The job description is often a way to tell if that's going to be a problem. So I'm going to say if you're writing a job description, and also as a candidate, think about this. What are the really essential things about this role? Python, maybe. Nice things to have. It'd be great if you've done Django, right? Or bonus points if you've also done some JavaScript or whatever. But really you want to match the interview questions to the role. And so it helps to go back and look at the job description again before you decide what the interview is going to consist of. So the 7 types of interviews then, if you look the whole spectrum, there's some overlap in most of these categories, right? Starting all the way at the top with the alchemist, right? The person who can code any algorithm that you could possibly need and optimize it. Going back to the other end of the spectrum, the person who's perfectly happy doing an analysis and talking to business people, right? Someone who can build a database from scratch. Someone who can run statistics and tell you how meaningful your metrics really are. Did you actually see a difference in that A/B test, right? Someone who's perfectly happy building the pipelines and cleaning the data, and they don't necessarily want to do the analysis. They're not going to get bored doing the data cleaning. As opposed to someone who really does want to be doing analysis and predictions, and they don't mind doing some data cleaning, but it's probably not their main job. Or the person that you bring in when your data is a mess, and you know it. And you don't know what went wrong. And they can look at a giant pile of data and tell you, this is what this data means. So think about where these different roles fit in the data stack, right? Where do you want to be in the data stack? And what does your data stack really need, right? So start at the beginning. Let's say you're a brand new company. You're designing schema for a brand new database. You have to clean the data, you have to pipeline it, maybe from some outside API. You're going to have to be able to query it with some SQL. You're going to do some analysis on it. You're going to do some visualization and show it to your business people, your investors, all that kind of stuff. You're going to want to do some statistics. Now you have some data, you're going to query it. Maybe you're going to want to optimize it at some point later. Maybe you're going to want to do some predictions going forward. So where do these roles fit, right? You've got someone who's your rock solid, I can make a database from the ground up. You've also got someone who can go in and look at your database and figure out what to do with it. Maybe you don't have any data science yet. You've got someone who's perfectly happy to do the pipelining, and they're going to get in there and get dirty and figure out how to make all these different APIs play well together. Business inspector person, I've mentioned several times, they're in a different place. They're really doing a lot of visualizations. They're good with color and design, and they know how to present something so that it's simple and accessible to a non-technical crowd. Whereas your algorithms alchemists, they probably never want to talk to the business people, right? They want to go hide in a corner somewhere and crunch. That's all they want to do. And your probability wizard, maybe they'll talk to the business people some, they're gonna do a bunch of math, they write some code, but they don't want to write tests. They're not really interested in making things productionized, right? And maybe you've got people who can kind of sit in the middle somewhere there, and they're able to make predictions, and maybe they're okay with productionizing code. Maybe that's not really their cup of tea. So, looking at all of the skill set and sort of everything that's in the data stack and where it fits inside your app and all the different maybe microservices of your company, you might want a bunch of data scientists. You're probably not going to find one person who excels at all of these things. So, you might want to think about, do you want to have someone who can do the bottom or the top, or a generalist who can kind of do everything until you can add more people? And I think we should really be thinking about evaluating candidates the same way we evaluate employees. And this is also an area that needs a lot of improvement, obviously. You can't necessarily look at the number of commits of a candidate, but it might help if you looked at their portfolio, their GitHub, something. Are they people who work steadily? Are they people who procrastinate and then make a whole bunch of commits all the night before? And if you have interview questions that are trick questions, ask your current employees, do they know the trick? I actually witnessed this happen in one of the offices that I worked in, where someone said, oh, I love asking this question, and it was a trick question. And most of the people at the company didn't know the trick. So I think if you have to give a hint, it's probably not a good interview question. It's fun, maybe, if you're into that sort of thing, but it's probably not a good way to evaluate a candidate. And I think some of us know about this. Recent study was highlighted. Google had an article in the New York Times about this, and there was a TED Talk about it last year. The idea of psychological safety is really important. You want your candidate to feel comfortable showcasing their skills. And if you make them uncomfortable because you think that pressure testing them is going to tell you something about their performance, you're going to miss out on a lot of really good candidates who are never going to work in a high-stress situation similar to this artificial interview process that you've created. Also, oops, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. It really helps to match the wording of the question to the intent. Make it really clear what you're trying to ask. So, for example, I used to interview a lot of junior people, so like an undergraduate or a brand new graduate student. It didn't really help to ask them, why do you want to work here? The answer was always, because I really need a job, right? It wasn't, they didn't know what you wanted to know. What you really wanted to know was, how did you find out about this particular job, and which part of it really excites you, right? Why are you interested in this role? And if they didn't have any relevant experience, that was okay, right? We really wanted people who had common sense and who could follow directions. So you look for things like, do you have equivalent skills from some other part of the world, right? Maybe you've never used a pipette, but you do know how to cook. Maybe you've never worked in a lab before, but we want you to take care of the frogs, and it turns out you worked in a pet store. That's fine. We know you can follow directions and keep frogs alive, right? So, if you can think of analogous skill sets, that can actually really help a lot. You can also look for other things like, is the person taking notes while you're talking to them? That can tell you a lot. On the other end of the spectrum, if you're interviewing a PhD, don't ask them, have you ever worked on a difficult project? Because the answer is always yes. Really what you want to know is, tell me about your research experience. Tell me how this is relevant to your interest in being a data scientist. Another question I got a lot, I still get, is, are you sure you want to leave biology, even though I left several years ago, right? I think as an interviewer, it's not really your job to try and project assumptions onto the candidate, right? Don't try and guess about their motivations. Really what you want to know is what interests you, right? How can we take advantage of your skill set and work well together? So I have some suggestions for types of questions that I think maybe we can't avoid them. Maybe we just need to think about a better way to ask them. Anything you could memorize or look up is probably not a great interview question. So, personally, do I know what a t-test is? Yes, I've published several corresponding author papers where we've primarily used things like t-tests. Could I give you a textbook definition of it in an interview setting? Probably not. So really, you think you're selecting for someone who's an expert in this area, but actually what you're selecting for is people who are good at memorizing an answer and then spitting it back out again. So it doesn't tell you whether they're going to be able to solve a new problem or if they know how to look something up when they haven't done it before. And I was actually really surprised to notice this difference between, say, the science background and the software background. I noticed a lot of my coworkers who came from a software background, when they ran across something they hadn't done before, their first inclination was to go to the command line and just try some shit, right? Whereas most of the scientists, the first thing they do is go to Google and look it up. Has someone done this before? Do I need to reinvent the wheel here? And you guys are laughing, but I think depending on where you're coming from, there's people who will be horrified if they see that you went to Stack Overflow to look for the syntax of how to sort a dictionary on the value. Because you can never remember that you have to import operator and it's item getter or something, right? So, think about where's this candidate coming from? They might know how to use Stack Overflow effectively because they're trying to save time. Or they might be the sort of person who's just kind of randomly trying to steal answers from around the internet and they don't really understand how to put these pieces together. So I think this is why people want to ask these kinds of questions, is to understand if people really know how to put the pieces together. Another kind of question that I think is common is to ask about a problem that your team found really difficult. You're hoping to hire someone who knows how to solve this problem. You figured it out, but it took you a really long time. And the problem with this is, best case scenario, you're going to find someone who has done this exact problem before. But again, it doesn't tell you whether they're going to know what to do in a new situation. And worse than that, it's kind of a lose-lose, because either you're going to be annoyed that they knew the answer, that it took you so long to find, or they're just not going to know, and they're going to feel like, how could they possibly expect me to know how to answer this? They didn't know how to answer it either. So, these kinds of questions sound like a good idea, but again, it's probably not going to be a scenario that sets people up for success. And again, the take-home data question, I think, is a great idea, but you have to bear in mind that it makes certain assumptions, right? In order to do well on this kind of a challenge, you have to have the time and money, right? It really does select for people who can set aside a day or a weekend, and they either have a pretty new laptop or they've used AWS and they know how to run things remotely. And it's oftentimes just not clear what they're looking for. So I think the ones that are the least effective are where the requirements are unclear and the people who ask the question, the hiring managers, make themselves completely unavailable after giving the assignment. Here's the assignment on a Friday afternoon. No one's going to answer email all weekend. Tell us about our data, right? Afterwards, they refuse to discuss your answer with you. So if you're going to do this kind of thing, close the circle, right? Make it a real collaborative work process, something that simulates what it would be like to be in the office with these people. Be on Slack, answer questions, and talk to them afterwards. Even if you didn't understand their answer, you thought it was messy, or they just panicked and only finished half of it. Because it'll be a really good learning experience for everyone about whether this was a good question. Did you give them so much data that they couldn't handle it on their laptop? Was the data so dirty that they spent 48 hours cleaning it and 2 hours analyzing it? Is that really what you wanted them to spend their time on? Think about these kinds of things before you ask these kinds of questions. And also bear in mind, may think that you're unbiased about what kinds of answers people are going to come up with, but you're not. This is your data, this is your company. You've thought about these problems a lot more than they have. You actually have some idea of what sorts of responses you're expecting, and probably what you're going to end up doing is selecting for people who think exactly like you do. They're going to do exactly the thing that you expected them to do. So, keep that in mind if you're going to ask these kinds of questions. Do you want someone who's going to do the expected thing, the machine learning algorithm that you think is the perfect type of classifier? If that's really what you think you want, then that's great. But at that point, you might as well just ask them to write that classifier. The questions that I think are really good are, again, these ones that really simulate the day-to-day. So what does this code do? I think these ones are great, where someone gives you some piece of code. Maybe it does or does not have doc strings. Maybe the names of the methods are obvious or not, because it shows the candidate what your code looks like also. And if they can't look at a new piece of code and talk through, okay, so we're instantiating this object, and we're initializing it with these attributes, and now we've got these methods on it, and we're going to go and get this data and talk through that, then they're not comfortable with the language. You didn't have to have them do any whiteboarding at all, and you know what their level actually is with something like Python. Similarly, if you give them a script that has a couple of bugs in it, I think this is a great interview question, because it's the sort of thing you end up doing in real life, right? Inheriting some legacy code that's broken. It may or may not have tests. And see, can this candidate figure out how did they go about debugging something? Again, I think it's great if you can have them present a data story. The drawback to this approach is that they have to have something they can present. So if they're coming from a company where they're not allowed to present what they worked on, it's kind of a problem. You might have to give them time to come up with the project. So that one, it can be hit or miss depending on the candidate, whether they can really commit the time to work on something like that. And if you're going to ask a specific kind of what would you do in X scenario type of question, try to be as specific as you can about the real problems that you face in your company. And I love these questions about what would you do with sparse data, or like the talk yesterday about unbalanced classifications. That's the sort of stuff you run into in the real world. And I feel like if you can have that kind of discussion with a candidate or with the team that you're thinking about joining, that's going to tell you a lot about how you're going to work together on real problems that aren't, pre-baked or already clean. And I think that's it. I'm going to stop and take questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we're going to take questions.
Thanks for the presentation. I thought it was really good. I like your categorization or subcategorization of data scientists. Do you think if people are interviewing for data scientist roles, they should maybe start using these titles instead of data scientist, because it's so broad and everyone seems to be a data scientist these days?
Yeah, I think we really should think carefully about what are these roles, because I run into, even within data engineering, what does that mean, right? In some cases, it means someone who's a software engineer who knows how to handle statistics, or they know what to do with data. But in other cases, it turns out what they actually wanted was someone who's DevOps, right? They wanted someone who knew how to spin up AWS and Redshift, and they think that's a data engineer, and maybe this person doesn't know anything about data. So yeah, I think we need to think about a finer grain of what are these roles, and not all companies are going to be able to hire 7 people to handle their whole data stack. But yeah, I think splitting it into smaller pieces might be helpful.
Hey, my question has to do with the progression of a data science interview. So you gave some great suggestions for questions to ask, things to do. In my experience, there's usually like a HR screening and then maybe some kind of live Q&A over the phone, coding, then you go on site, or have a data take-home challenge, then you go on site. Based on kind of your suggestions, what do you see as a good cadence of like how many steps do you think there should be in a data science interview, and then how should you progress through the kinds of questions you ask at each step?
I think that's a great question.
Could you repeat the question?
So in terms of how you progress through a data science interview process, what should the steps be? So I think the take-home data challenge is not a bad way to go. The HR screen is fine, usually. I think it's basically just can you converse? It doesn't even have to be anything about your skills. I think the only problem with that screen often is that they typically have a list of, have you done X? And they don't know what X is. So if you've done something equivalent, they don't know what that means. So you could get filtered out at that stage just based on resume mismatch or something. And then I think that, if you're going to go on site after a data challenge, that's probably the best. I think doing those 3 steps might be okay, right? Talk to someone, either the HR or the hiring manager, and then do a data challenge, and then go on site and discuss your solution and maybe discuss some other things with the team. I think the ones that I've done that were really frustrating, I had a couple where I did a coding challenge that went really well. They liked my solution. We never discussed it. And then they wanted me to do a live coding challenge after that, over the phone. And I was like, I'm local, you're local. Did you look at my coding challenge? Why did I spend half a day writing this code for you? And we're not even going to talk about it. So I think, really thinking about, do you trust this? If you're going to give someone a take-home challenge, you have to figure out how you're going to assess. Do you believe that they wrote this code themselves? If you don't believe that, or you're worried about that, then maybe do the phone challenge instead. Don't do both of those, because that's just a waste of time, in my opinion.
Right. So if you look at it from the business perspective, typically to get value, they really need 3 people. They need the data engineer who knows Hadoop and Redshift and Vertica and all of that stuff. They need the data scientist, and then they need the analyst. So every successful data project typically needs these 3 roles. So have you ever found companies being honest and saying, look, we need these 3 roles, but we don't want to spend the money for these 3 roles. So we're trying to find the one unicorn who can do all 3, right? And then secondly, expectations, because guess what? The real world data is dirty. So 75% of the time, you spend your time as a data janitor. And 25% is when you spend it as a data scientist, actually doing algorithms. First, you have to get the data clean so you can work on it. So have you found people being, like the conversation on the side of both candidates and the interviewers, honest about these 2 aspects?
I think yes and no. I think a lot of startups around here would love to have 3 people, the analyst, the engineer, and the data scientist. And they're maybe hoping they can get by with one person who is both the data engineer and the data scientist. On the other end of the spectrum, you have people who maybe they already have some stuff in a database and they want to go cheap, so they're going to get an analyst, skip the data scientist, right? It's much cheaper to buy someone straight out of college and they just use Excel and that's fine. So I think, depending on so many factors, yes, expectations and how the company's growing, how much time they have, right? Because you want someone, ideally, either to set up a really robust pipeline so the data is getting cleaned as it's going through, so then your data scientists and your analysts can just take the data and do stuff with it, right? Or you give them a bunch of dirty data that you've just dumped in a pool somewhere, and you expect them to build that into their timeline, that they're going to spend most of their time cleaning and a tiny fraction of their time thinking.
Thanks, this is great. These are pretty dysfunctional use cases you're throwing out here, but I'm wondering, in your 30 samples of interviews, how endemic do you think this is? What percentage would you just kind of heuristically just guess is, how bad is this a problem?
So your question is how many companies really fall into this
Yeah.
trap? I don't know. I would say most. Honestly, I'm not going to try and put a number on it. I think there's a lot of times where there's multiple teams at a company that do different kinds of data science. And then you get into an even bigger mess, right? Because now you've got two teams at the company who are actually kind of competing with each other over who gets to do what. And it might be just the luck of the draw, which team you end up interviewing for and what their process looks like. And is that really a good fit? I don't know. And who you get, right? I have a friend, the FizzBuzz and TensorFlow guy. Have you seen his talk? And he likes to say that we're all just coins, right? You're a coin flip. On any given day, you might be the best version of yourself or the worst version, right? And so you go to an interview and they flip you 5 times. And if you're lucky, you get an offer, right? But it's just, you don't know who you're going to be meeting with that day, whether you're going to really communicate well, what sort of question they're going to ask you, if you've seen it before. You know, I think it's a difficult problem. How do you really select the right candidate? But I also think with experience and really thinking carefully about what do we need here, rather than the kind of like, oh, we're going to cover our eyes and do what everybody else does. Software engineer, let's do whiteboarding solution. It doesn't have to be that hard.
More questions for Samantha?
I think that's it.
That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.